On the bank of the river Ilissus, in the long light of a Greek afternoon, Socrates stood with his sandals in his hand. The water moved past him, shallow and clear, carrying the particular sound that rivers carry in summer. Not loud, not quiet, but continuous, like thinking that has found a steady rhythm and no longer needs attending to. The plane trees along the bank cast the kind of shade that arrives gently and settles. The city was behind him, its noise already muffled by distance and the small slope of the ground. He had been talking for hours, as he almost always had. He had said what he needed to say about love and beauty, and the soul's long desire for what it once knew and could only half remember. And now the afternoon had moved in its ordinary way toward the hour of return, and the road back to Athens waited, and he had lifted his sandals in the way a man lifts ordinary objects when something is about to begin. He stopped, not dramatically, not in the manner of a man receiving a vision or struck by heaven. He stopped the way a person stops when something familiar arrives, the way a sound in the night resolves into the known creak of a familiar door, and the body already attuned to it simply waits. His weight shifted back. His feet found the grass again. The sandals stayed in his hand, held loosely, and he stood there at the edge of the water, in a stillness that had nothing of urgency in it. Something had turned him back. Something interior, wordless in the way that most reliable things are wordless, had arrived. Not commanding, not threatening, simply present. A kind of restraint that belonged to him, the way his way of walking belonged to him, the way his voice belonged to him, shaped by decades of use into something entirely his own. He had felt this before. He had felt it many times. Since childhood, he said later, it had been coming, this quiet signal, this inner halt, this slight and consistent pressure against what he had been about to do. He waited. He turned back. He sat down in the shade and said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, that the sign had come and he could not cross yet. His companion that afternoon was a young man named Phaedrus, who had been carrying a copy of a speech about love, and who had been delighted to find Socrates willing to sit and talk through the long heat of the day beside a river. Phaedrus would have known what the sign meant. Everyone who spent time with Socrates knew what it meant, in the sense that they had been told of it, had heard him mention it, had watched him pause and adjust his course, with no explanation other than the quiet declaration that the inner voice had intervened. What it actually was, what moved in him when it moved, this was something no one, including Socrates, had claimed to fully know. He called it, when he spoke of it at all, a kind of voice, a phony. The Greek word carries less than the English word does in one direction and considerably more in another. It does not quite mean a sound heard with the ears. It describes something with a voice's character, a quality of communication, of transmission, of something received rather than produced. But it belongs to the interior, to the space where the self conducts its most private business, where decisions form and intentions take their first quiet shape. When Socrates used the word, he was not describing an auditory experience in the simple sense. He was reaching for the nearest available language to name something that language had not quite been built to hold. What the Greeks called it was the daimonon. The word requires a little patience. It does not name a creature. It does not name a god. Scholars who have spent careful years inside the original Greek have noted that the form of the word, its grammatical shape, the diminutive neuter ending that gives it its particular weight, describes a quality rather than an entity. A daimon was a figure of intermediate standing, something between the mortal and the divine, a category of being that the Greek religious imagination had long held open without filling precisely. Daimonon was smaller than that, less defined, less substantial. Not a name for something that existed clearly and could be pointed to, but a way of indicating the character of an experience, divine something the scholars reach for, hovering at the edge of what any noun can hold. It named a quality of encounter. It said what arrived here had, in it, the nature of something that comes from beyond the ordinary. Socrates was careful with the word. In the Apology, the account of his trial that Plato wrote, which has come down across 24 centuries with a quality of personal presence so strong that readers across that distance still feel addressed by it. Socrates introduces the daimonion almost in passing. He mentions it without ceremony, the way a person might mention a companion they have walked beside, so long that introduction seems almost unnecessary. There is a divine and daimonic something, he says, and then he continues, and the something in that sentence has puzzled careful readers ever since, not because it is obscure, because it is precise in a way that resists the categories the mind immediately wants to reach for. The daimonion, as Socrates described it, did one thing. It stopped him. That was all. That was the entire extent of its operation, so far as he reported it, and he reported it in a manner that suggested he had no reason to embellish. He was about to take an action, begin a journey, pursue a course, set out across a river, enter a conversation that would go somewhere he had not intended, and the signal came, and he did not do it. The daimonion was, in his own account, purely prohibitive. It never offered a direction. It never told him what to pursue, what to say, what argument to make, where to walk. All of that was left to him entirely, to his reason and his conversation, and the long patient work of dialectic that he had been doing in the agora and at dinner tables and beside rivers since he was old enough to ask a question with enough precision that the asking itself revealed something about the one being asked. The restraint was the whole of it. The boundary was the whole of it. And Socrates, rather than finding this diminished or frustrating, seemed to have found in it something he trusted more than he trusted many things that came with full arguments and elaborate explanations. He trusted it because it had been consistent. Since childhood, he said, since before there was a philosophy, before there were the long conversations in the agora, before the oracle at Delphi had said anything about wisdom, the signal had been there, arriving in its own time, departing without ceremony, leaving him simply in the place he had been before, with all his decisions intact, and only one fewer path before him. The oracle at Delphi was not like this at all. Some miles from Athens, cut into the cliffs of Mount Parnassus, the sanctuary of Delphi received pilgrims from across the Greek world and beyond, arriving with their offerings and their questions, their anxieties about war and succession, and the approval of the gods. The Pythia, the priestess who served as the medium of Apollo's communication, sat in a stone chamber filled with the smell of laurel leaves and the particular quality of air that deep enclosed spaces have, close, mineral, weighted with the accumulated breath of centuries of supplication. She spoke her responses in states of altered presence, her words received and recorded and interpreted by the attendant priests, shaped into verse, carried back to the cities and the kings who had sent their emissaries to ask. The whole apparatus was institutional, communal, mediated through a chain of human interpretation, and the authority of its responses depended on its situation within a recognized religious structure that Athens and all of Greece acknowledged. Socrates received his signal alone, in plain silence, with no priest, no ritual, no incense, no attending community, no mechanism of interpretation beyond his own long experience of the thing itself. The daimonion spoke to no one else. It did not offer pronouncements on public matters. It did not advise the city or address the generals or offer guidance on the collective decisions that the Athenians made in their assembly. It arrived at specific moments in Socrates' individual life, in relation to specific actions he was about to take, and it spoke, if speaking is even the right word for a communication so interior, only to him, about him, concerning precisely the next step he had been on the point of taking. This was unusual in Athens. It was unusual in a way worth staying with, because the forms of divine communication the Athenians recognized were almost all of them communal, institutional, or at least mediated. Bird augury required a trained reader of signs. Dreams required interpretation, and there were those whose role it was to perform that interpretation. The oracles spoke to cities, to generals, to men of consequence, asking questions of public weight. Even the most private forms of religious communication occurred within a recognized framework of practice and understanding that connected the individual to the community and the community to the gods in a chain that everyone could, at least in principle, follow. Socrates had something that required none of that. His signal was private in a way that had no precedent in the religious life of his city, and his relationship to it, the calm, decades-long, intellectually unhurried relationship he maintained with something that could not be argued for or against, could not be submitted to cross-examination or demonstrated to another person, was more unusual still. Athens had seen people seized by divine experience. Athens had seen the theatrical frenzy of the Bacchic rites, the dramatic communications of oracular possession, the visible and public moments when the divine was understood to arrive in human life with force and consequence. What Athens had not quite seen was a man who had been quietly accompanied by a private divine restraint since childhood, and who spoke of it with the mild, matter-of-fact equanimity of someone describing the weather. There is a way of reading the Apology in which the introduction of the daimonion feels like a minor biographical note, a small clarification offered before Socrates moves on to the larger arguments about wisdom and the examined life. And then there is a way of reading it in which the daimonion is central to the entire self-portrait Socrates offers, the evidence that something beyond ordinary human arrangement has been directing, or at least limiting, the shape of his life, the grounding for his claim that what he does is not the voluntary behavior of a man with interesting philosophical hobbies, but the obedience of someone under instruction, the quiet structural fact that underlies every other claim he makes about who he is and why he has lived as he has. Plato, writing the Apology, knew that readers would notice the daimonion. He placed it in the text with the careful attention of someone who understood that the word daimonion would carry a specific charge in a specific cultural and legal moment. The men who had charged Socrates used, in their indictment, a phrase about new divine beings, kaina daimonia, and the echo between that phrase and the word Socrates used for his own inner signal was not something a careful reader in Athens could miss. Plato, who was careful always, made sure the introduction of the daimonion in the Apology was neither apologetic nor dramatic. It arrives the way Socrates himself said the signal arrived, without fanfare, without explanation, simply as a fact about a life that has been lived with it long enough that the person living it no longer regards it as remarkable. And yet, it was remarkable. It was remarkable enough that the scholars who would come centuries later to the Greek text, men trained in the precision of ancient grammar, alert to the exact weight of every construction, found themselves stopping at the diminutive neuter form of the word, at daimonion, and noticing what it did and did not say. It did not say there was a being standing at Socrates' shoulder and whispering in his ear. It did not say there was a demon, in the later sense of the word, that would come down through Christian usage, carrying its associations with malevolence and possession and the opposed supernatural order. It said, as nearly as any noun could say, that a quality had arrived, that something with the character of the divine was present in this experience, that this experience had, in it, the nature of an encounter with something that comes from outside the merely human. The grammar was careful. The grammar was doing work that a more confident or a more careless word would not have done. Socrates was good with careful words. He had spent his entire philosophical life attending to the distance between what a word seemed to say and what it actually meant, pressing that distance open with questions until what had seemed obvious became uncertain, and what had seemed uncertain became the most interesting thing in the room. When he used the word daimonion for his inner experience, he was using it with the precision of a man who had considered the alternatives. He was not saying God. He was not saying spirit. He was not saying voice, exactly though he used phony alongside it. He was gesturing with a carefully chosen imprecision at something that his honest philosophical attention had found to be real and continuous and reliable, and for which the language available to him was genuinely, not performatively, inadequate. The afternoon on the bank of the Ilissus moved through its ordinary paces. The river sound continued. The shade of the plane trees shifted slowly. Phaedrus waited, in the way that people who have spent time with Socrates learn to wait, not impatiently, because impatience in his presence had a way of feeling beside the point, but with the particular alertness that comes from knowing something is about to be said that will require attention. Socrates sat down in the shade and said that he had turned back because the sign had come, and then because that was not quite enough, because the moment required a little more than a bare announcement, he said something about divine attention. He said that the divinity might be displeased with him for something he had said earlier, some careless thing about love that had not honored what love truly was. And then, because he was Socrates, and because he could not be in the vicinity of an error without wanting to correct it, he spent the remaining hours of the afternoon trying to say, more truly, what love actually was, and what the soul was, and how beauty worked on the person who was genuinely capable of seeing it. None of that would have happened if the signal had not come. The signal said, not this direction, and Socrates, who had been turned back by it since childhood, accepted that restraint with a quietness that is itself worth attending to. He did not argue with it. He did not test it. He did not apply to it the same cross-examination he applied to every other claim that arrived in his vicinity. He simply stopped and waited and turned his attention to what else might be done, and found, as he apparently almost always found, that the not going there was the opening of something else that would not have been found had he gone. This is a particular kind of trust. It is not the trust that follows from argument, from evidence weighed and found sufficient. It is the trust that accumulates through long experience of a specific thing, the way a craftsman trusts the feel of a material after decades of working with it, the way a sailor trusts a particular quality of wind that the sea charts do not mention, the way anyone who has paid sustained attention to something learns to receive its communications in advance of understanding them. Socrates had been paying attention to this signal since before he could have named it or described it to anyone. By the time he was in his 70s, standing at the edge of a river on a warm afternoon, the signal and the trust in it had become simply a feature of who he was, as ordinary and as essential as his way of asking questions. What set Socrates apart from his contemporaries in Athens was not that he received divine communications. His contemporaries received those too, in the forms their religious culture recognized and made available. What set him apart was this calmness, this persistent, undramatic, decades-long equanimity in relation to something that most people, encountering it, would have surrounded with ceremony or anxiety, or at the very least with a somewhat larger reaction than he gave it. He mentioned the daimonion the way he mentioned most things, as a fact worth noting, to be examined with the same clear-eyed attention he gave everything, and not to be inflated beyond what honest examination could support. The oracle at Delphi, in its stone chamber, gave its pronouncements to pilgrims who had traveled sometimes very far to receive them, carrying the questions of cities and generals, surrounded by the weight of accumulated religious expectation. The Pythia entered an altered state. The priests recorded and translated and arranged the words into verse. The whole procedure was built to make the communication feel as vast and consequential as it was intended to be, because what was being communicated required that vastness, required the architecture of ritual to make its authority legible to the people who needed to receive and obey it. Socrates, somewhere across the city, or on a road, or on a riverbank, received a quiet interior signal that no one could see, that required no interpretation, because it had no content to interpret, that arrived without ceremony and departed the same way, leaving him simply standing still where he had been about to move. The signal carried no words. It explained nothing. It offered no reason. It only ever said, in the wordless way, that the most fundamental interior communications tend to say things, not this. And from that bare restraint, across decades of a philosophical life, a great deal followed. It followed because Socrates accepted it, not passively. Nothing about him was passive, but with the active, considered acceptance of a man who had examined his own experience with sufficient honesty to know when something was worth trusting. He could not demonstrate the daimonion's reliability to anyone else. He could not show it, produce it, submit it to shared rational examination. It was private in a way that was irremediable. Two people could examine an argument together and work through its steps, and arrive, if the argument was sound, at the same conclusion. The daimonion could not be shared. It was his, in the way that the particular quality of one person's attention is always and only their own. But he had lived with it long enough to know its character. It was consistent. It did not dramatize itself. It did not arrive in moments of emotional excess or demand. As far as he could tell, a particular psychic state, in order to make itself felt. It arrived when he was about to act, and it stopped him, and then it was gone, and the situation was exactly as it had been before, minus one direction forward. This consistency, this unvarying pattern of a purely prohibitive restraint that had been present since childhood and had never once in all the decades of his philosophical life overreached into the prescriptive, had never told him what to do. Only what not to do was itself a kind of evidence, not proof in the philosophical sense, but the kind of evidence that a careful person accumulates slowly and takes seriously precisely because it has accumulated slowly and never contradicted itself. The word daimonion was in ancient Greek a form that the grammarians would have looked at with some interest. Its diminutive shape, its neuter gender, its derivation from daimon, while being not quite the same thing, these were the features of a word that had been reached for carefully, selected for its imprecision in precisely the places where imprecision was the honest choice. There was something here. The something partook of the daimonic character, had in it the quality of a communication from beyond the merely human. What exactly it was, how exactly it operated, where precisely it fit in the ordered landscape of divine beings that the Greek religious imagination had mapped with such long attention. These were questions that the word daimonion deliberately did not answer. Socrates, who had spent his life showing other people how much they did not know about things they had been certain they understood, seems to have applied the same standard to his own experience. He had the signal. It had been with him since childhood. It was reliably prohibitive and never prescriptive. It was private. It was, in his honest assessment, somehow divine in its character. And that was as far as the honest examination could go, and he was content to leave it there, which was more than most people were content to do with the things they most trusted. On the bank of the Ilissus, in the shade, the conversation that followed the Daimonion's intervention became one of the most beautiful things Plato ever wrote. It moved from a flawed account of love to a correction of that account, from the surface of desire to the soul's deep recognition of what it had once known before it was confined in a body, from the ordinary afternoon light on water to something that the afternoon could only gesture toward. It got there because Socrates was stopped. It got there because the signal came, and he turned back and sat down in the shade and said, "Let me try again." This was, perhaps, the most telling thing about the daimonion and the life shaped by it. It never pointed toward anything. It never indicated a destination. It cleared a path by closing one path. It created an opening, not by directing towards something, but by making the wrong direction unavailable, and then leaving everything else, the whole wide remainder of possible action and thought and conversation and movement, entirely to the man who stood there with his sandals in his hand and his weight settled back into the ordinary afternoon. The positive decisions were his. Every argument he made, every question he asked, every direction he chose to walk, every friendship he formed, every long conversation at a dinner party that went until dawn, all of this came from Socrates, from his reason and his curiosity and the particular character that had been formed across decades of philosophical life. The daimonion contributed something different, something negative in the technical sense, a subtraction, a pruning, a consistent removal of the paths that went wrong. And in that negativity, across so many decades, the shape of a life became visible in the way that the shape of a carved thing becomes visible as the surrounding material is removed. Not built from the outside in, not assembled according to a plan, but found gradually as what it was not fell away. There is something in that image worth staying with. A shape discovered through subtraction rather than construction. A life whose contours emerged not from a positive program, not from a philosophy that said, "Here is the good life, walk this path," but from the long, patient accumulation of small restraints, each one saying only this much: not here, not now, not in this direction. All the rest was Socrates. The talking, the questioning, the sitting in the cold of military campaigns in states of interior absorption, so deep that the soldiers gathered to watch, the refusing to be silenced by people who found the questioning inconvenient, the patience, the humor, the absolute refusal to pretend to know what he did not know. The daimonion never told him where to go. In all the decades it accompanied him, from childhood through the philosophical life, in the agora, through the military campaigns and the friendships and the long arguments and the dinner parties and the river banks and the plain city streets of Athens, it offered him nothing in the way of destination. It offered him a limit. It offered him a clarity about one particular direction at a time, once in a while, when the direction would have been wrong. And in the space that the limit created, the life that philosophy calls examined, The life turned toward its own foundations, asking what it actually believes and why, found room to move. The freedom that lives inside a limit is not the first kind of freedom that comes to mind. The first kind is the open field, the unmarked road, the absence of constraint. But there is a second kind, less obvious and perhaps more interesting, that comes from the removal of a wrong direction, from the moment when something in the terrain of a life says clearly, not that way, and the person who receives that information finds, in its clarity, a kind of ease. Not knowing where to go is one thing, knowing where not to go is something else entirely. It is small, it is precise, it is in its smallness and its precision more actionable than any general prescription for how to live. Socrates stood at the edge of the Ilissus with the sound of the water moving past him and the shade of the plane trees cooling the air. He had been about to cross. The signal came as it had come since childhood, without drama and without explanation, and he turned back. He sat down. He said, in the plain tone he used for all his most careful observations, that the divinity had stopped him. And then, because that was the whole of what he had received and the whole of what he could honestly report, he said nothing more about it and turned his attention to the afternoon and the conversation that was still unfinished and the question of what love really was and all the other questions that the Dominion had never answered and had never been asked to answer. It had not told him what to find. It had only told him, once again, where not to go. And in the space between the stopping and the going somewhere else, the afternoon opened, the shade deepened, the river kept moving past, and the work that was properly his, the asking, the examining, the patient and undefended search for what was actually true, continued in the only direction it ever moved, which was toward whatever came next. Alcibiades was not a man given to reverence. Those who knew him said so openly, and the record of his life does nothing to argue otherwise. He was brilliant and reckless, handsome in a way that seemed almost deliberately unfair, and constitutionally uninterested in the admiration of anyone he did not already admire. Yet there was one story he told and kept telling and could not seem to stop telling, even years after the events in it had passed. He told it at dinner parties, wine in hand, in the particular way people tell stories that have not yet finished doing something to them. And the story was always the same. It was about a night at Potidaea, in the frozen north, during a siege that had already gone on longer than anyone had expected, and about a man who stood perfectly still in the cold for an entire day and an entire night, and gave every appearance of not finding this unusual. The soldiers noticed him first at dawn. Socrates had stopped walking sometime around sunrise, and by mid-morning it was clear he had no intention of moving. He was standing in the same spot, turned slightly inward, his face carrying the particular expression of someone engaged in a conversation no one else could hear. The men who saw him first told the men nearby, and those men told others, and by evening a small group had gathered a short distance away, watching with the mixture of curiosity and unease that attends anything genuinely inexplicable. Some of them had their cloaks wrapped around their shoulders against the cold. Socrates was standing in his ordinary clothing, which was not adequate for the temperature, and seemed not to notice. The night came on. The stars turned. Some of the soldiers brought their bedding outside and lay down to watch him. Alcibiades said, as though watching was itself a kind of tribute. When the sun came up, Socrates said a short prayer to it. Then he walked away. Alcibiades told this story because he did not know what else to do with it. He was a man who had seen extraordinary things, and who understood, by the time he told the story, that what he had witnessed at Potidaea was not the kind of extraordinary he had encountered before or would encounter again. It was not the extraordinary of a brave act or a brilliant tactical decision or a moment of political theater performed for an audience. It was something else, something interior, operating by principles he had no framework for, producing in a man he knew very well a quality of stillness so complete that an entire night of freezing cold had passed through it and left no mark. He did not use the word daimonion when he told the story, or not always. He talked instead about the inner life of Socrates, the self-possession, the composure, the sense of a man entirely unreachable by the things that ordinarily reach people. But anyone who knew Socrates understood what he was talking about. There was always in any account of Socrates the same quiet background presence, the voice that had accompanied him since childhood, the inner signal that had never once pushed him forward, but had, across decades of living, redirected him away from actions he was about to take. At Potidaea, on that frozen night, something had held him standing. He had, in his usual manner, stood and waited to find out why. The life of Socrates is not a life that resolves easily into the familiar shapes of biography. There is no single dramatic reversal, no youthful mistake corrected by mature wisdom, no clean arc from ignorance to enlightenment. What there is instead is a long, patient, and in some ways almost monotonous consistency. The same man, asking the same questions, in the same city, decade after decade, shaped from the inside by a set of convictions so stable that even a war could not dislodge them. The daimonion was part of that consistency. It had been there since childhood, Socrates said, a companion so familiar it needed almost no introduction when he finally mentioned it in his defense at trial. He mentioned it the way a person mentions a habit of thought, not as something that would surprise them, but as something they assumed any careful listener had already inferred. What is striking, looking at the shape of his life across the years, is how little the daimonion seems to have disrupted it. That might seem paradoxical at first. A voice that arrives uninvited and redirects a man away from his immediate intentions might be expected to produce a life of constant interruption, of plans left half-made, of a man perpetually halted mid-stride in the middle of Athens. But that is not the picture the accounts give. The picture they give is of a man for whom the inner signal had become so natural, so woven into the ordinary texture of decision-making, that its arrivals were less interruption than adjustment. He had learned, across what must have been many years, to pause when it came, and to trust that the pause was worth attending to. The trust had made the whole arrangement quiet. There is something in that quietness that speaks to the long work of a life lived attentively, the way repeated attentiveness to any signal eventually produces not anxiety, but a kind of readiness, a practiced willingness to notice without being disturbed by what is noticed. The Athens Socrates moved through for most of his adult life was not the Athens of its golden age. By the time he was in his middle years, the Peloponnesian War had begun its long and grinding destruction of the world that Pericles had shaped. The war went on for nearly 3 decades. It ended in defeat, in the dismantling of the long walls that had protected the port, in the burning of the fleet, in a regime change so violent and so brief that the city was left afterward with the particular kind of grief that comes from having survived something shameful. The 30 tyrants held power for just over a year before they were overthrown, but the year was enough. The trials and executions of those months left marks that did not fade. When democracy was restored, it came back carrying the anxieties of a city that had recently watched its own institutions turned against it, and there were people in that restored democracy who remembered, with a kind of retrospective suspicion, the men who had spent time in Socrates' company. Alcibiades, who had been one of his closest companions, had switched sides during the war in ways that cost Athens enormously. Critias, who had led the 30 tyrants, had also been part of the circle around Socrates. None of this made Socrates responsible, but it made him, in the eyes of some, someone whose conversations had perhaps produced the wrong kinds of people, and suspicion of that kind, once it takes hold in a wounded city, tends not to release easily. Through all of it, Socrates had kept walking. He walked in the agora in the mornings, stopping people he knew and people he did not know, to ask them what they most cared about and what they thought they knew. He walked to the gymnasia and the public spaces where men gathered to talk. He walked, apparently, without charge, without accepting fees, without accumulating the kind of comfortable material life that his contemporaries might have expected of a man with his reputation. He was in his 70s, and he was still asking the same questions he had been asking in his 40s, and the consistency of this, the sheer, patient, undeflectable consistency of it, was itself a kind of statement about the relationship between an inner conviction and an outer life. He had, at some point well before the period his trial makes visible, decided what the work of his life was, and the daemonian, in all that time, had never once told him to stop. This is worth holding for a moment. The daemonian was entirely prohibitive. It never told Socrates what to do, only what not to do. It arrived as a restraint, not a direction, and so across the full arc of his philosophical life, the decades of questioning, the conversations in the agora, the long relationships with students and friends and interlocutors, the continuous effort to discover what the Delphic oracle had meant when it said no one was wiser than Socrates. Through all of it, the daimonion was silent. It let him walk, it let him ask, it let him argue, it let him do the particular work that defined him so completely that we still know his name. And in that sustained silence across those decades, there is something that functions as a kind of endorsement, not directed, not declared, but present in the absence of any signal to stop. Cherephin had been the one to ask the oracle. Cherephin was an old friend, enthusiastic in the way that people are enthusiastic when they believe deeply in someone, and he had made the journey to Delphi and stood in the incense-filled space and put his question to the Pythia, the priestess, through whom Apollo was said to speak. The question he asked was whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle said no. Socrates, when he heard this, was troubled in a way that speaks well of him. He did not take it as flattery. He took it as a puzzle because he knew with some certainty that he was not wise in any way he could easily describe. And yet here was the oracle, an institution his city took seriously, a voice that carried the weight of Apollo behind it, saying that no one surpassed him. He spent a long time trying to understand what this could mean. He went to the people in Athens who were supposed to know things, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, and he talked with them. And what he found, again and again, was that they believed they knew things they did not know. He knew that he did not know. This, he eventually concluded, was what the oracle had meant. His wisdom was of a specific and modest kind, the wisdom of a man who does not mistake ignorance for knowledge. And having arrived at that conclusion, he felt, in some way that he understood as a religious obligation, that the work of his life was to share it, to go on asking, to keep exposing the gap between what people thought they knew and what they could actually demonstrate. He understood this as a form of divine service, as something the god had asked of him. The daemonian never discouraged it. There is a tenderness in that somewhere. A man who spent his life in service to a difficult and often unwelcome task, sustained in part by the fact that the inner signal he trusted had never once told him the task was wrong. He could not have been unaware of the discomfort his questioning caused. The people he talked to did not always leave the conversation grateful. Politicians found their policies incoherent under examination. Poets discovered they could not explain what their own poems meant. The craftsmen, who knew genuine things about their craft, had the unfortunate habit of assuming that knowing how to make excellent sandals also gave them insight into justice or virtue or the proper ordering of a city's life. Socrates pointed out carefully and repeatedly that these were different kinds of knowledge. This did not win him many friends. It won him instead a reputation, and the reputation was not entirely warm. There were people in Athens who found him irritating. There were people who found him dangerous. The comedy of Aristophanes had put him on stage decades before the trial, turning him into a figure of ridicule, a man in a basket, thinking absurd thoughts, corrupting the young. The caricature was not accurate, but caricatures rarely need to be accurate to do their work, and this one had been doing its work for years, before anyone thought to write down the formal charges. Crito arrived before dawn. This is a detail the accounts preserve with some specificity, because Crito had bribed the prison guards to let him in early, and the time matters to the shape of the scene. Socrates was already awake. Crito said later that he had not wanted to wake him, had sat watching him sleep for a while before Socrates opened his eyes, and that the sleep itself had been evidence of something that a man facing death in a matter of days could sleep that deeply, was either alarming or instructive. And Crito was not sure which. The ship had not yet returned from Delos. Every year, Athens sent a sacred ship to Delos to honor Apollo, and while the ship was at sea, no executions could take place. The ship had been delayed, which meant there was still time. Crito had arranged everything. There were friends waiting, money enough, places outside Athens where Socrates could go and be safe. All he had to do was walk out. Socrates said no. He said it with the patience of someone who had already thought through the question thoroughly, which he probably had. He spent the conversation not defending his refusal, but examining it, the way he examined everything, turning it over, asking Crito to consider what it would mean for a man who had spent his life arguing that justice matters above comfort, to suddenly discover that when comfort was genuinely at stake, justice was negotiable. The laws of Athens, he said, were like parents. He had been raised by them, educated by them, shaped by them. He had lived within them for 70 years. To walk out now, simply because the outcome had gone against him, would be a betrayal of something he had said he believed. And Socrates did not leave what he believed at the door when the price of believing it became inconvenient. This was not courage in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and in its own way more complete. The consistency of a man whose outer life had been shaped so thoroughly by his inner convictions that the two had long since become the same thing. The structure of that refusal, the personified laws, the extended philosophical argument conducted in the dark of a prison cell before anyone else in the city was awake, carries in it the same quality as the daimonion. Not the voice itself, perhaps, but its logic. The daimonion was an inner signal that arrived with authority, that Socrates trusted without requiring it to justify itself through argument, and that had shaped his behavior across decades by setting limits rather than providing direction. The argument in the Crito sets limits in a similar way. The laws do not tell Socrates where to go. They tell him where he cannot go. They arrive as a restraint on what he is about to do. And Socrates, who had spent a lifetime learning to pause at exactly that kind of signal, paused again. There is a version of this that might look like stubbornness, or a kind of philosophical vanity, the man so committed to his principles that he cannot bend even to save himself. But the accounts do not support that reading, and not only because Socrates himself explicitly examined and dismissed the idea that consistency required death. The picture that emerges is of someone for whom the inner life had become so thoroughly organized around certain values that the question of whether to live in contradiction to those values was in a genuine sense not a difficult question, not because it required no thought, but because the thought had been done already, had been done across decades of philosophical work, in hundreds of conversations, in the slow accumulated weight of a life examined honestly and not found wanting. The morning in the prison cell was not the moment of decision. The decision had been made long before, in the daily work of being the particular kind of person Socrates had become. What remained in the cell was only the living out of it. The daimonion had been part of that forming. It was not the whole of it. There was also the rigorous argument, the dialectic, the long practice of following a question wherever it led, regardless of whose vanity it injured. But the daimonion had been there alongside all of it, a quiet companion in a life that was fundamentally a life of interior discipline. It had never once pulled him in a direction. It had only on certain occasions stopped him from going where he was about to go. And then it had left him to decide, by whatever combination of reason and judgment and cultivated character he could bring to bear, what the right direction was. This is a relationship between inner signal and rational agency that the accounts do not fully explain. They preserve it instead, as they preserve most of what is most interesting about Socrates, in the form of an open question. How much did he trust the signal because it had always been reliable, and how much did it seem reliable because he had learned, through practice, to attend to it rather than dismiss it? The answer, if there is one, is probably somewhere in the long years between childhood and old age, in the hundreds of moments when the signal came, and he paused, and the pausing turned out to have been worth it. The retrieval from Delium is less vivid in the sources than the night at Potidaea, but it lives in Alcibiades' account with the same quality. The battle had gone badly. The Athenian forces were retreating, and a retreat in ancient warfare was among the most dangerous moments a soldier could face, the moment when the formation broke and every man was most exposed. Alcibiades, on horseback, watched Socrates walking away from the battle with Laches the general, and what he noticed, what he could not stop noticing, was the manner of it. Socrates was not running, he was not stumbling or looking back over his shoulder with the particular expression of someone monitoring the approach of disaster. He was walking with what Alcibiades described as his characteristic air of composed alertness, the same unhurried attention he brought to a conversation in the agora, applied here to a field from which an army was in disordered flight. He was looking around him steadily. He appeared to be thinking whatever was happening outside him, the noise and confusion and danger of the retreat, had not found any purchase on whatever was happening inside him. He walked away from Delium the way he walked everywhere, as though the quality of the walking was itself a philosophical statement about how a person ought to move through the world. Alcibiades attributed this composure, both at Potidaea and at Delium, to the same inner self-possession that made Socrates who he was. He was not trying to make a philosophical point about the daimonion when he told these stories. He was trying to convey, to listeners who had perhaps met Socrates in the agora and had some impression of him, what it was actually like to be near him in circumstances that tested what a person was made of. What it was like was settling. This is not a word Alcibiades used, but it is the effect his descriptions produce. There was something about the composure of Socrates, the sense of a man entirely organized around some interior principle that the exterior world could not reach, that produced in people nearby a version of the calm it expressed. Not always. There were people who found the composure infuriating, who felt accused by it, who heard in it a kind of silent reproach. But there were also people, and Alcibiades, despite himself, was among them, who found near it something they had not expected to find near anyone, which was a genuine sense that a human being could actually be at home in their own life, that the interior of a person could be, if attended to carefully enough over a long enough time, a place of genuine rest. The oracle's pronouncement that no one was wiser than Socrates had given his questioning a structure it might not otherwise have had. It made the questioning feel to Socrates himself like a religious obligation rather than a personal preference. He was not wandering through Athens out of curiosity alone, though the curiosity was certainly real. He was doing what the god had asked. And in that framing, the daimonion and the oracle were not two separate sources of divine guidance, but expressions of the same underlying orientation, a life being lived in attentiveness to something beyond its own immediate comfort or convenience. The oracle spoke through an institution, through ritual and incense and a specially appointed priestess, in the manner Athens expected divine communication to arrive. The daimonion spoke in private, with no ceremony, requiring no interpreter, arriving and departing in silence, but both, for Socrates, pointed in the same direction. They confirmed from different angles that the examined life, the patient, consistent, unresting effort to know what was actually true, was the life he was supposed to be living. The city that had produced this conviction was also, by the time of the trial, a city that had reasons to be suspicious of it. This is one of those places where the shape of a life and the shape of a historical moment meet in ways that produce in retrospect the appearance of inevitability. There was nothing inevitable about the trial of Socrates. The charges were specific, the jury was large, the margin of conviction was narrower than is often remembered. A shift of a few dozen votes would have changed the outcome, but the conditions that made the charges possible, the conditions that meant a significant portion of 501 Athenian citizens were ready to vote against this particular man, had been accumulating for years. The associations with Alcibiades and Critias, neither of whom was remembered fondly in the restored democracy, the long habit of asking questions that made people uncomfortable, the reputation for impiety that Aristophanes had helped build and that had been circulating in various forms for decades, the general anxiety of a city trying to reconstitute itself after collective trauma and reaching, as wounded institutions sometimes do, for the satisfying clarity of a clearly defined threat. Against all of this, the daimonion had said nothing. It had offered no warning, no restraint, no signal to turn back. Socrates had walked into his own trial the way he walked everywhere, composed, attentive, prepared to make his case in the only way he knew how, which was to say what he actually thought, and to examine his own thinking with the same rigor he applied to everyone else's. He had not hired a speechwriter. He had not drafted an emotional appeal designed to play to the jury's sympathies. He had not brought his wife and children to the courtroom, weeping, as defendants sometimes did, to generate the kind of feeling that might soften a vote. He had stood up and said what he believed. He had said that the daimonion was real, that it had always been real, that it was a sign of divine favor rather than divine offense. He had said that the god Apollo had asked him to do this work, and that he would keep doing it even if they let him go and told him to stop. He had said that the unexamined life was not worth living, and he had said near the end that the daimonian had been silent all day, and that this silence was, for him, the most informative thing about the proceedings. He meant it as a philosophical observation, not a provocation. The daimonian's silence, in his long experience of it, meant that what was happening was not genuinely harmful to him, not in the deepest sense of harm, which for Socrates had never been about physical comfort or safety or the mere continuation of breathing. The deepest harm was the harm to the soul, the corruption of character, the embrace of injustice, the abandonment of the examined life. The daimonian had never been a guardian of his physical safety. It had been, as near as he could interpret it, a guardian of something else, something he had spent his life trying to understand and describe with the inadequate tools of language. And on the day of his trial, in the face of a verdict that would, within a matter of weeks, end his life, it had remained quiet. There is a kind of philosophy in that quietness, not the philosophy of the argument or the dialectic, but the philosophy of a life that has been so thoroughly examined, so patiently organized around what it actually values, that even its ending can be received without panic. Socrates at 70, standing before 500 jurors, had been thinking about what it means to live well for his entire adult life. He had been listening to an inner signal he trusted for as long as he could remember. He had been doing in the agora and the gymnasia and the homes of friends and the public spaces of Athens the work he believed the god had asked of him. And when the daimonian had nothing to say, what that meant in the only interpretive framework he had developed across decades for making sense of it was that there was nothing here requiring warning, that whatever was coming was not by the measure that most deeply mattered, a harm. A life fully examined may arrive at its end without the need for further warning, not because examination produces certainty, or because a man who has thought carefully enough is somehow exempt from the losses that come at the end of every life, but because the examination, sustained over time, produces a particular relationship to what is actually valued. Socrates had known for a long time what he valued. He had tested it repeatedly against interlocutors who pushed back, against circumstances that would have made it convenient to value something else, against the accumulated social pressure of a city that was not always comfortable with what his questioning turned up. He had kept coming back to the same things: truth, the health of the soul, the examined life, whatever the god required. The daimonian had never once told him this was wrong. In its long decades of occasional arrivals, it had redirected him away from certain actions and left the rest entirely to him. And the rest, it seems, had been this: the patient, consistent, unrelenting work of thinking honestly about how to live, carried out in the open, in the middle of an ordinary city, until there was nothing left to warn against. The silence on the morning of his trial was not an absence. It was the culmination of a long and specific relationship between a man and an inner experience he had trusted without fully understanding, across a life that had been shaped from the inside into something he could stand behind. Whatever it had been, the voice that only stopped, it had been for Socrates enough. In the spring of 399 BCE, a court official in Athens took up a stylus and pressed into soft clay the words that would make one man's inner life a matter of public record. The name of the accuser was Miletus. The name of the accused was Socrates, son of Sophroniscus of the Dema Alopecia. And among the charges set down in the formal language of Athenian law was a phrase that had never quite appeared in such a document before: kaina daimonia, new divine things, unauthorized divine beings introduced into a city that already had gods enough of its own. A private experience, decades old, had been lifted from the interior of a single life and pressed into the clay of civic accusation. The inner voice had become a legal object. What had been heard in silence now had to answer in public. The agora that morning would have looked like any other morning. Merchants setting out their stalls, the smell of bread and dust and olive oil warming in the early sun. Somewhere in the city, the man whose inner life had just been formally accused was walking or sitting or asking someone a patient question about what they believed justice to be. He had been doing this for decades. He had made of it something very close to a vocation, and the fact that it had now attracted the attention of the courts was not, to Socrates, a surprise. The Damnion had never warned him away from philosophy. It had never stopped him in the agora and turned him back towards silence. Whatever the inner signal had been guiding him away from, all these years, it had not been this. The formal charge deserves to be held steadily for a moment, because its phrasing is careful in a way that reveals exactly what Athens found dangerous. The accusation was not that Socrates denied the gods outright. Anaxagoras had been charged with something closer to that, decades earlier, for claiming that the sun was a hot stone and the moon a reflective rock, a position that stripped the heavenly bodies of their divinity and replaced them with physics. Socrates' charge was more particular and in some ways more interesting. He was not accused of disbelief. He was accused of innovation. The problem was not that he worshipped nothing, but that he appeared to worship something that had not been approved, something that did not fit within the recognized civic architecture of divine relationship that held Athenian life together. The gods of Athens were communal possessions. Their worship was a civic act. The oracle at Delphi, the augurs who read the flight of birds, the priests who oversaw the great public festivals, all of these were legible within a shared religious grammar. What Socrates described was something else, a private signal, a voice that spoke to him alone, that no priest had authorized, that no tradition had named, that could not be consulted by anyone else or verified by any external standard. In the legal language of the time, this was kainodaimonia, and kainodaimonia was precisely what the law prohibited. The scholar Mark McFerrin and others who have spent long years with these texts point out that the word daimonion in Socrates' own descriptions carries a particular grammatical weight. It is a neuter adjectival form, not a noun that names a being. It does not say there is a daemon, a spirit, a god. It says something more like, there is a divine something, a quality of divine experience, a signal of the divine kind. Socrates was himself careful about this. He did not, in the Apology, present the daemonion as a personal deity, a guardian spirit, a being with a name. He described it as a voice, or something like a voice, that had been with him since childhood, that arose to stop him from what he was about to do, and that had never once told him what he should do instead. The precision of this is important. The accusers said he was introducing new divine beings. What Socrates actually described was something harder to categorize, and therefore, in a culture that ran on categorical religious clarity, something harder to accommodate. Not a being, not quite, a divine something that had been turning him back from certain paths his whole life long. The Apology is the document that survives. It is Plato's account of what Socrates said at his trial, shaped by Plato's memory and his art, and it should be held as that. Not a verbatim transcript, but a philosophical portrait, rendered by someone who was there, of the arguments Socrates made in his own defense. What strikes almost every careful reader of the Apology is the quality of attention Socrates brings to the moment. He is not performing outrage. He is not performing innocence. He is doing what he has always done, which is looking at the question as carefully as he can and saying what he finds. And what he finds when he turns his attention to the daimonion is that its existence actually complicates the charge of atheism rather than confirming it. If he recognized no divine presence at all, he would not have spent his life attending to one. The fact that he describes decades of inner guidance from something he calls divine should count by any reasonable reading as evidence of religious belief rather than its absence. But here the defense becomes structurally interesting, because what saves Socrates from the charge of atheism may simultaneously deepen the charge of impiety. In insisting on the reality of the daimonion, in describing it as genuinely divine in character, he is also confirming that he has been privately in relationship with a divine entity, or divine something, that no Athenian religious institution has recognized or sanctioned. He cannot have it both ways without walking into the architecture of the charge. If the daimonion is real and divine, then he has been attending to an unauthorized divine presence. If it is not divine, then why trust it at all, and why invoke it now? Socrates appears aware of this. He does not resolve the tension with a clever argument. He simply states the experience as he has known it, traces its consistency across his whole life, and suggests that a man who has been sent on a divine mission by Apollo, as he reads the oracle's pronouncement, is unlikely to be an enemy of the gods. The daimonion and the oracle together, in Socrates' reading, point in the same direction toward a life of philosophical questioning undertaken in obedience to something larger than civic convention. Whether the jury found this persuasive is a matter of historical record. They did not. The vote was approximately 280 to 221 in favor of conviction, a margin that is close enough to suggest a genuine division in the room, but not close enough to suggest that Socrates came anywhere near persuading a majority. 501 citizens had gathered to weigh the life of a single philosopher, and what they found, taking everything together, was that the life did not pass the test. It is worth staying with the human texture of this moment rather than moving past it too quickly. These were not abstractions voting. These were Athenian citizens, craftsmen, merchants, veterans of the Peloponnesian War, men who had watched their city's empire dissolve, and its long walls come down, and its democracy twice suspended. Some of them had lost sons in the war. Some had lived through the terror of the 30 tyrants. Some had heard stories about Alcibiades, who had been associated with Socrates before defecting to Spain and bringing catastrophic harm to Athens, or about Critias, another figure in Socrates' orbit, who had been among the most brutal of the oligarchic leaders during the tyranny. The political atmosphere of Athens in 399 was not a neutral backdrop. It was saturated with recent grief and suspicion, and Socrates' habit of questioning democratic assumptions had a specific resonance in that atmosphere that he may have underestimated or may have simply chosen not to address in the way the moment required. The apology does not read as a speech designed to win. This has troubled readers for as long as the text has existed. Socrates declines the strategies that might have helped him. He does not weep. He does not bring his family before the jury to inspire pity. He does not flatter the jurors or soften his position or suggest that perhaps the charge had some merit and that he would modify his behavior accordingly. When the jury convicts him and asks him to propose a counter penalty, he initially suggests free meals at the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic athletes and great civic benefactors, before arriving at the offer of a modest fine, only under pressure from his friends. This is not the behavior of a man trying to save his life. It is the behavior of a man who is trying to remain, even in this room, on the morning of his potential death, what he has always been, which is to say, honest, even when honesty is the most dangerous thing available. And this connects directly to how Socrates frames the daimonian's role in the trial. In the closing section of the Apology, after the death sentence has been voted, Socrates returns to the voice. He notes that the daimonian has been silent throughout the entire proceedings, that at no point on this day, from the moment he left his house in the morning to the present moment of standing in the courtroom with a death sentence voted against him, has the inner signal arisen to stop him. He has come to understand this silence over decades. The daimonian, when it arises, stops him from actions that would genuinely harm him. Its silence, therefore, means something. Not merely that this particular day has been uneventful in the interior sense, but that whatever is happening to him today is not the kind of harm the daimonian protects against. It is not a bad thing in the way the daimonian's warnings identify bad things. Something else must be true of it. What Socrates draws from this silence is one of the most philosophically striking moves in the Apology. He does not argue that the jury was wrong, that the verdict was unjust, that the charges were false. He may believe all of these things, but what he offers instead is a different kind of evidence. The daimonian has been with him since childhood. It has turned him back from actions that would have been genuinely harmful across a whole lifetime. It has been, in his experience, reliable. And on this day, in this place, with this verdict, it has not spoken. The most natural reading of its silence, given everything Socrates knows about how it works, is that what is happening to him is not genuinely evil. Death, he suggests, is either dreamless sleep, in which case nothing can be lost, because there is no one left to experience the loss, or a journey to a place where one might speak with others who have died, which seems to Socrates rather more interesting than staying in Athens. Either way, the daimonian's silence suggests that he need not be afraid. This is philosophy being done at the extreme limit of what philosophy can be asked to do. Most philosophical arguments are conducted at a comfortable distance from consequences. The argument about whether knowledge requires certainty, or whether virtue can be taught, or whether justice is stronger than injustice, these are questions that can be approached with the leisure of someone who has time to think. Socrates in the Apology is approaching them on the day of his death sentence, using them not to delay the consequences, but to understand them, to inhabit them with some degree of clarity. And the daimonian, in this context, is not a comforting thought he is reaching for. It is evidence. The inner signal that has guided him for 70 years has not opposed today. That fact, for Socrates, is more informative than the vote. The charge of asabeia, impiety, had a history in Athens that Socrates would have known. Anaxagoras had been charged with it, or something like it, for his physical theory of the heavens. Protagoras had attracted suspicion for his agnosticism about the gods. The category of impiety was elastic enough to cover a wide range of heterodox positions, and its application tended to intensify during periods of civic stress. The years after the Peloponnesian War were such a period. A city that has suffered what Athens had suffered, the death of its navy, the loss of its empire, the humiliation of foreign occupation, the internal violence of the oligarchic terror, is a city searching for explanations. It is a city in which old categories of loyalty and impiety, orthodoxy and danger, carry an urgency they may not carry in more settled times. Socrates had spent decades questioning the assumptions that his fellow citizens held most dearly. He had done this in public, with a wide circle of listeners, several of whom had gone on to cause Athens genuine harm. Whatever the precise legal logic of the charge, the political logic is not difficult to see. None of this is to suggest that the charge was philosophically correct. The apology makes a serious case, and the case deserves to be heard seriously. Socrates argues that his questioning has always been in service of something he understands as a divine command, that the oracle's declaration that no one was wiser than Socrates prompted him, in his puzzlement, to spend his life examining the wisdom of others, and that this mission, far from being an act of impiety, was an act of obedience to the god Apollo himself. The daimonion fits into this framework. Both the oracle's pronouncement and the daimonion's guidance point in Socrates' reading in the same direction toward a life of honest questioning, pursued without concern for personal comfort or social approval, undertaken because the god has said it is needed. To punish this mission, Socrates argues, would not punish an enemy of the gods, it would punish their most earnest servant. There is something in this argument that the 280 jurors who voted to convict may not have found persuasive, not because they missed the logic, but because the logic depended on a prior acceptance of Socrates' claim about the daimonion's nature, that it was genuinely divine, genuinely reliable, genuinely oriented toward his philosophical mission, and this is precisely what was in dispute. To accept the argument, one had to accept the premise. To accept the premise, one had to accept a form of private divine experience that operated entirely outside the religious institutions that gave divine experience its publicly legible meaning. The oracle at Delphi spoke to everyone who consulted it. The augurs read signs that any trained eye could learn to read. The festivals and sacrifices of Athens were communal enactments of a shared divine relationship. The daimonion was available to no one but Socrates. It was not the kind of divine experience that a democratic jury could weigh and verify. It was, by its very nature, beyond collective assessment, and perhaps that, more than any legal technicality, is what made it impossible to accommodate. The city was also younger than the philosophical problem. Athens had been managing its relationship with the divine for centuries through institutions that turned private experience into shared ritual, that translated the unpredictable movements of divine favor into legible communal practice. Into this managed, collective, institutionally embedded relationship with the divine, Socrates had been inserting, for decades, the claim that he had a direct and purely private signal from the divine realm, one that bypassed institution, bypassed interpretation, bypassed communal verification entirely, because never seemed dangerous before. Socrates had been a familiar figure in the Agora for so long that his habits of questioning and his mention of the inner voice were simply part of the texture of Athenian philosophical life. But contexts change. What is tolerable in prosperity can become intolerable in grief, and the city of Athens in 399 BCE was a city still learning to carry what it had lost. 3 accusers brought the charge. Meletus was the named prosecutor, a poet of unremarkable reputation, who seems to have brought the charge with genuine conviction, even if his understanding of what he was charging was, by Socrates' account, somewhat imprecise. Anninus was the more politically consequential figure, a democratic leader, and successful businessman who had lived through the tyranny and emerged from it with standing and purpose. Lycon represented the interests of the rhetoricians, the professional teachers of public speech, a class of practitioners who had specific reasons to find Socrates irritating. Together they constituted not a unified philosophical objection, but a coalition of civic irritations brought together by the shared sense that Socrates had been unsettling the city's foundations long enough. The charge of impiety was the legal instrument available. The kainedaimonia phrase was the specific hook on which the inner voice could be caught and brought before the court. Socrates stood before the jury and described the daimonion the way he always described it, not apologetically, not strategically, but with the plain attention of someone reporting a fact about their experience. He did not dress it up or qualify it into something more palatable. He did not suggest that perhaps he had misunderstood it, or that it was merely a poetic way of describing something more conventionally religious. He said, in effect, there is a signal, it has been with me since I was a child, it stops me from certain actions, it has never once told me what to do, and it has never opposed my philosophical mission. That is what it is. Take it for what it is. This quality of his defense, the refusal to make himself more legible to those who are judging him, is one of the things that has made Socrates a persistent figure in the philosophical imagination. He is not trying to win, he is trying to be honest. And this distinction in a legal proceeding is a dangerous one. Courts are designed to produce verdicts. They require the participants to translate their experience into forms the court can process. What Socrates offers instead is something more direct and for the court more opaque, a description of interior experience that cannot be verified, offered without apology, by a man who seems more concerned with accuracy than with survival. The second vote, the one that chose between Socrates' proposed penalty and the prosecution's proposal of death, was larger than the first. More jurors voted for the death sentence than had voted for conviction, which suggests that something in Socrates' behavior during the penalty phase had hardened the resolve of those who were already opposed to him and added to their number. The counter penalty of free meals at the Prytaneum was, whatever Socrates' philosophical intention, exactly the kind of response that a jury already uncertain of his character would find confirming of their suspicions. A man facing death who proposes civic honors as his penalty is either a man of extraordinary philosophical equanimity or a man who does not take the proceedings seriously. The jury, by its vote, indicated which interpretation they preferred. The daimonon was silent through all of this, through the speeches and the votes and the proposal of penalties and the final sentence, through whatever Socrates said to his friends in the aftermath, whatever arrangements were made, whatever the first hours of understanding this outcome actually felt like in the body of a man in his 70s who had spent his whole life believing that the examined life was worth living and was now receiving the city's official assessment that it was not. The inner signal that had been turning him back from harmful actions for as long as he could remember said nothing. And Socrates, reading that silence in the way he had learned to read it across 7 decades, allowed himself to find in it something that might have looked from the outside like equanimity, but was perhaps something more precise than that. Not the absence of feeling, something closer to the presence of information. Philosophy, at the trial of Socrates, was not an abstract discipline in the keeping of specialists. It was on trial literally, in a room of 500 people, with its most recognizable practitioner standing before them, offering it as his defense. The question being asked, however the legal language framed it, was whether a life devoted to honest questioning, guided by private inner experience rather than communal religious institution, oriented toward virtue rather than prosperity, conducted in service of what its practitioner understood as a divine command, whether such a life had value, had standing, had a right to continue. The verdict of 399 BCE is a matter of historical record. The question itself has not been settled in the years since, which is perhaps as it should be, with a question of that weight. What Socrates left behind in the Apology is not a legal argument, it is something closer to a philosophical testament. The daimonion appears in it, the way it appears in everything Socrates says about it, without drama, without apology, without metaphysical inflation. It has been with him. It has been consistent. It has been, in his experience, good. And on the day when the city of Athens brought all the weight of its collective judgment to bear on the question of what his inner life had meant and what it deserved, the daimonion remained exactly what it had always been, quiet, interior, available only to him, and, in its silence on that day specifically, more informative than any verdict. The sun would have set over Athens that evening, as it set every evening, without ceremony, without commentary on what the day had held. The long shadows of the Parthenon falling across the rock below, the sounds of the city moving into its evening register, fires being lit, children called in from the streets, the particular quality of light that falls on old stone at the end of a spring day in the southern Mediterranean, warm and unhurried and completely indifferent to the proceedings of human courts. Socrates would have walked or been accompanied from the court to whatever came next, carrying the death sentence the way he had always carried difficult knowledge, looking at it, attending to it, trying to understand what it actually was before deciding what it meant. And the daimonion, which had turned him back from so many things across so many years, said nothing about any of it. In a lifetime of learning to read that signal, Socrates had learned also to read its absence. The silence on the day of his trial was not a withdrawal. It was, in the only language the inner voice had ever used, a form of guidance, not telling him where to go, only, as always, where not to turn back from. Plato was old by the time he returned to the question. The skin of his hands had grown loose over the bones, and the fingers that held a stylus now moved more slowly than they once had. But the question itself had not aged at all. It was the same question it had always been. What, exactly, had his teacher's inner voice been? Not what it had said. The daimonion had said very little. Strictly speaking, what it had done was stop. And in stopping, it had shaped a life. And in shaping a life, it had left behind a kind of residue, something that could not be explained by the ordinary categories available to an Athenian philosopher or to any philosopher who came after. Plato had spent decades building a system large enough to hold it. He was not certain, even now, that the system was large enough. There was a manuscript before him, or the memory of one. The question had appeared in so many forms over the years, in dialogues, in lectures, in the conversations he still held in the Academy's shaded colonnades, with men young enough to be his grandchildren. The question kept returning because it kept refusing to close. A private signal, arriving without argument, operated by a man who had staked his entire life on the authority of argument, and the signal and the life had never, in all those decades, contradicted each other. This was not a paradox that could be dissolved by being more careful with terms. It was a real feature of a real person, and Plato had loved the person before he had theorized the feature, which made the theorizing both more urgent and more resistant. He had tried, in the Symposium, to find a philosophical form for it. The figure of Eros appeared there not as a god, exactly, and not as a human being, exactly, but as something in between, a daimon, a being that occupied the space between the mortal and the divine, carrying messages upward and downward, making possible the communication that neither extreme could make on its own. In the speech he had attributed to Diotima, the woman of Mantinea, the prophetess, a figure who may or may not have existed in exactly the form the dialogue preserved her. Plato had described Eros as the great intermediary, as the force that moves between hunger and fulfillment, between ignorance and knowledge, between the human soul in its ordinary life and the form of the good in its unreachable clarity. Scholars across many centuries would read that passage and hear in it something more personal than its mythological dressing suggested. The space Plato gave to Eros was the space he was trying to find for the daimon, the space between what could be argued for and what could only be received. Whether Plato believed this interpretation in the way he believed his geometric proofs is a different question, and one that he himself probably could not have answered cleanly. Philosophical writing, at the level Plato worked, is rarely simple belief set down in prose. It is more often the attempt to find a structure large enough to hold what the author has encountered, and the structure itself is always partly the encounter and partly the desire for the encounter to make sense. The daimon as intermediary was both an answer and a vessel, something to carry the question in while the question remained, as it had always remained, open. Xenophon had a different view, and it is worth pausing on Xenophon for a moment, because he had known Socrates from a different angle. He was a soldier, a man of action, someone for whom the gods were real in the way that weather was real, not in need of philosophical elaboration, simply present, and sometimes helpful. When Xenophon wrote about Socrates in his Memorabilia, he wrote about a man who was visibly favored by the divine. The daimonion in Xenophon's account was not a philosophical puzzle requiring a theory of intermediary beings to explain. It was simply a sign. The gods gave signs through birds, through entrails, through oracles, through dreams. Socrates received his through a private inner signal. The category was familiar. The delivery mechanism was unusual. But the basic structure, divine favor expressed through a reliable signal, was not so different from what the priests and augurs at any temple in Athens would have recognized. Xenophon set the daimonion inside a world he already understood, and in doing so he made it smaller, perhaps, but also more immediate. He was not wrong, exactly. He was reading a phenomenon through the most available framework his culture offered, which is what careful observers always do. The framework did not do full justice to what made the daimon philosophically strange: its privacy, its complete separation from any institutional authority. The way it spoke only to Socrates and only about Socrates, and never issued a pronouncement that could be verified or contested by anyone else. But it did make contact with something real. The daimonion was, among other things, an experience of what Xenophon's world called divine communication. That it was also something harder to categorize does not mean Xenophon's reading was simply wrong. It means the phenomenon had more than one edge. Plato and Xenophon were both present for some portion of Socrates' life, both writing within living memory of the man, and they produced accounts of his inner voice that did not quite agree. This is itself a philosophical fact worth holding. The daimonion was, among its other qualities, a private experience, one that Socrates could describe, but that no one else could access directly, verify independently, or fully inhabit from the outside. What survived the life were the reports, and reports of private inner experience are always already interpretations. The question of what the daimonion was, from the very beginning, inseparable from the question of who was doing the asking. The centuries that followed produced more questioners, each bringing a different set of concerns to the same original material. The Stoic philosophers, beginning with Zeno of Citium, not long after Plato's death, found in the figure of Socrates something they needed for their own project, a demonstration that the inner life, properly cultivated, could become a site of genuine moral authority, not dependent on external circumstance, not overturned by poverty or exile or death. What the Stoics reached for in their technical language was the concept of the logos, the rational principle running through all of nature, the same reason that ordered the cosmos, expressing itself in the individual soul's capacity to know what was truly good and what was merely apparent. The inner voice that stopped Socrates at the critical moments, that turned him back from what he was about to do, that maintained its authority even in the face of the city's legal machinery. This looked to the Stoics like a vivid and historically documented instance of the logos at work. Marcus Aurelius came to this material near the end of a long chain of transmission, 4.5 centuries after Socrates died, in circumstances that could not have been more different from an Athenian street. He was an emperor. He commanded armies. He spent years on the northern frontier watching soldiers die of plague and battle in roughly equal measure, and in the evenings of those campaigns he wrote in Greek a series of private notes that he appears never to have intended for publication, attempts to hold himself to the philosophy he had studied as a young man against the considerable pressure of a life that offered many inducements to forget it. In those notes, which are now read as the Meditations, he returned again and again to the image of an inner faculty he called the hegemonikon, the governing part, the rational center, the element of the self that could step back from circumstance and assess it rather than simply being swept along by it. The language was Stoic, the underlying experience of an inner authority that operates independently of external pressure, that does not argue but simply indicates that one learns over time to trust rather than override, carried the shape of something Socrates had described centuries before. Marcus does not cite Socrates' daimonion explicitly in those passages. The Stoic philosophical language had become the medium, and the daimonion had become, in some sense, absorbed into it, translated into something more systematic and teachable. But the kinship is visible. Both the daimonion and the hegemonikon name something private, interior, more reliable than opinion or desire, something that the person who has cultivated it can use not to decide what to pursue, but to avoid what should not be pursued. The prohibitive quality, never prescriptive, only restraining, appears in Marcus as the Stoic discipline of desire, not the elimination of desire, but the refusal to let any particular desire run unchecked past the inner governor's quiet assessment. What Socrates had lived, Marcus was trying, in his military tent by lamplight, to turn into a practice. That practice was not effortless for Marcus. The Meditations are not the notes of a man who found equanimity easy. They are the notes of a man who found equanimity necessary and was working at it day after day against the considerable friction of an emperor's life. He had to remind himself repeatedly of things he already knew. He had to write the same conclusions more than once because the conclusions, known intellectually, kept needing to be recovered as lived orientation. There is something in this that would have been recognizable to Socrates, the understanding that philosophical knowledge is not simply acquired and stored, but practiced and maintained, and that the inner signal one learns to trust is not automatic but cultivated over years by a life that takes the cultivation seriously. The distance between Athens in 399 BCE and the Danube frontier in the 2nd century of the Common Era is very large, measured in geography and culture and institutional context. What crosses that distance, carried in the careful language of Stoic philosophy, absorbed into the daily practice of a Roman emperor's private notes, is something that had its most vivid and historically documented form in the life of a man who walked barefoot on Athens' stone streets and stopped without drama whenever the inner signal arrived. Hegel stood before students in Berlin more than a millennium and a half after Marcus wrote his Meditations, and he came to the question of the daimonion with a different kind of attention, historical, dialectical, interested, less in what the voice was than in what its emergence in the life of Socrates had meant for the development of human consciousness. Hegel was building in his lectures on the history of philosophy an account of how spirit, Geist, the rational life of humanity, understood as a single unfolding project across historical time, had come to know itself through the specific philosophical moments that had shaped each era's understanding of the relationship between the individual and the community. Socrates was, for Hegel, one of the pivotal moments, not because Socrates was a tragic hero, not because the Athenians who convicted him were simply wrong, but because the collision between Socrates and Athens was, in Hegel's view, a genuine collision, two valid principles meeting in historical time, neither capable of accommodating the other, both expressing something real about what it means to be human in a community. The community, embodied in the laws and customs and collective religious life of Athens, had its own kind of authority. It had shaped Socrates. It had given him the language and the institutions and the interlocutors without which his philosophy would have had nothing to push against. The city was not simply wrong to take its own coherence seriously, but Socrates had introduced something the city's framework could not contain, and the daimonion was, for Hegel, the clearest emblem of it. The daimonion was the first fully documented historical instance of individual subjective moral conscience as a force capable of standing against the external authority of the state. Not conscience understood as a private preference, not the individual simply preferring what the community forbade. That was as old as human selfishness. But conscience understood as an inner moral principle with genuine authority, which the individual could not, in good conscience, override, even when the community demanded it. This was something new. When Socrates said, in the Apology, that if the city ordered him to stop philosophizing, he would disobey, because his philosophical mission was the command of a higher authority than Athens, he was enacting what Hegel saw as a historically decisive moment in the long process by which humanity came to understand that the individual inner life is not simply a dependent expression of the community, but a source of moral authority in its own right. The tragedy in Hegel's reading was not that Socrates was an innocent man condemned by corrupt men. The tragedy was that the collision was genuine and necessary. Athens had to defend its ethical life. Sittlichkeit, the collective customs and norms through which a community reproduces and sustains its shared understanding of the good. And Socrates had to follow his inner principle. And in the historical moment where these two valid things met, something had to give. What gave was Socrates. But what did not give, what survived the execution and continued to move through Western history, was the principle the daimonion had embodied, that there is an inner court to which a human being is responsible and whose authority exceeds the authority of any external institution. Hegel was not sentimental about this. He did not say Athens was simply wrong and Socrates simply right. He said the collision was the kind that only happens at genuinely historical moments, when one principle that has governed human life has run to the edge of what it can accommodate, and a new principle is forcing its way into existence. The violence of those moments is not cruelty, but consequence. The tragedy belongs to history itself, not to the particular men who enacted it. This is a large claim, and it is the kind of claim that can be lived with slowly, turned over in the dark, without urgency, held as one way of looking at a very old story, neither forced to be the whole truth, nor dismissed as mere abstraction. Students in Hegel's lecture hall in Berlin received this account in a room full of other students, taking notes, arguing afterward in corridors about whether Hegel's historical framework was the right one, whether Athens had been wrong, whether a philosophy that calls a tragedy necessary rather than unjust has said the right thing or evaded the harder question. Philosophy, at its most alive, does not resolve these disagreements. It carries them forward into the next conversation, and the next, until the question finds a form in which it can rest without being closed. Gregory Vlastos came to Socrates from a different angle entirely, from within what had become by the 20th century a highly developed tradition of careful analytical scholarship that read ancient texts with the same attention to logical structure one would bring to a philosophical argument produced the previous week. Vlastos spent decades reading Plato and writing about Socrates, and the work he produced was marked by a combination of rigorous argument and genuine admiration, a scholar's love for his subject that never softened into uncritical reverence, that kept returning to the hard places in the texts and refusing to smooth them over. The hardest place for Vlastos was the one that had been there from the beginning. Socrates was the philosopher most committed in his entire method and his entire life to the authority of logos, of rational argument, carefully examined, tested by dialectic, refined through the kind of conversation that Socrates spent his life pursuing. He insisted in dialogue after dialogue that opinion was not knowledge, that authority was not truth, that what could not survive rigorous questioning did not deserve to govern anyone's life or choices. This was not a rhetorical position for Socrates. It was the deepest commitment his philosophy embodied. No belief was to be trusted simply because it was widely held, or culturally inherited, or arrived with impressive institutional backing. The only thing that deserved trust was what survived honest examination. And yet, and this is the unresolved tension Vlastos found himself sitting with, years into his scholarship, there was the daimonion. The daimonion could not be submitted to dialectic. It could not be argued for. It could not be shared with another person, refined in conversation, tested against objection, or grounded in the kind of principled reasoning that Socrates applied to every other matter of importance in his life. When the inner signal arrived, Socrates stopped. Not because an argument had convinced him, not because he had reasoned his way to the conclusion that stopping was correct, because the signal had come, and in a lifetime of attending to it, he had found it reliable, and that was the only justification he ever offered for the trust he placed in it. Vlastos laid this out with the kind of care that good philosophical scholarship produces, not to diminish Socrates, but to be honest about what was there. The puzzle was real. A man who demanded rational warrant for everything else in his life gave no rational warrant for the thing that may have shaped more of his life than anything else. The daimonion was not a minor feature. It had been present since childhood. It had influenced decisions Socrates considered significant enough to report to the jury at his trial. It had been silent at the moment, he believed, when its silence mattered most, and it remained, after all the scholarly attention, irreducibly non-rational, not irrational, not opposed to reason, but simply outside the domain where reason operated, arriving from a place no argument could reach, and delivering its signal through a mechanism Socrates himself never claimed to understand. One reading of this Vlastos acknowledged. is that Socrates was simply inconsistent, that the philosopher of Logos had a blind spot, a place where the commitment to argument gave way to something less examined. But this reading does not quite settle the matter, and Vlastos did not let it. Another reading is that Socrates had, through a lifetime of philosophical practice and genuine self-examination, cultivated an inner faculty that operated at a level below argument, without being less reliable for that, a kind of integrated moral attentiveness that expressed itself as the prohibitive signal, and that was, in practice, trustworthy enough to deserve the trust he gave it. The second reading leaves the tension in place rather than resolving it. It says that Socrates held, in a single life, both a commitment to argument and a trust in something that argument could not reach, and that these two things coexisted without destroying each other, and that the coexistence is philosophically interesting rather than philosophically embarrassing. Vlastos sat with that tension for years. The papers and books he produced did not resolve it. They made it more precise, which is the most honest thing philosophy can do with a tension that has no clean resolution. The precision itself is a kind of gift, to know exactly where the question lives, to be able to point to the specific place where the argument runs to its edge, to say here, this is where the puzzle is, not elsewhere, not nearly here, but here. This is what careful scholarship offers, that blunter instruments cannot. And the tension Vlastos identified in Socrates between Logos and the daimonion is one of the places where, if the pointing is honest, the philosophy has found something real. The question of what to do with that tension is not one Vlastos could answer for anyone other than himself. He kept working. He kept returning to the texts. He wrote with the patience of someone who had accepted that the question would not close in his lifetime and had found, in that acceptance, something that allowed the work to continue without urgency. This is itself a Socratic posture, the willingness to remain in the vicinity of a hard question without demanding that it yield, to keep examining without expecting that the examination will end, to find the examination itself valuable, regardless of whether it arrives at a conclusion that can be tidily stated and set down. The tradition that holds all of these readers, Plato in the Academy, Xenophon in his exile, the Stoics in their gymnasia, Marcus on the frontier, Hegel in Berlin, Vlastos at his desk, is not a tradition of converging answers. It is a tradition of careful attention to the same original material, applied through different frameworks, in different historical circumstances, by different kinds of minds, with different questions. What passes through the tradition is not a solution. It is the question itself, kept alive by the quality of the attention each generation has given it, refined by being turned over in more hands, carrying more surface than it did at the beginning. The daimonion, by the time it reaches the hands of a 20th century analytical philosopher, is not quite the same object it was in the hands of Plato. It has gathered readings the way old stone gathers the marks of weather, not damaged by them, but shaped, the shape itself a record of the attention. Plato's reading gave it metaphysical depth. Xenophon's reading gave it cultural legibility. The Stoics gave it practical application. Hegel gave it historical significance. Vlastos gave it philosophical precision. None of these is the whole of what it was. Each is an honest engagement with a portion of what it was, and the portions together do not add up to a completed picture, but to something more like a conversation about a picture, the picture remaining, behind all the conversation, slightly beyond what any single reading can fully encompass. This is the condition of all the most interesting philosophical objects. They are not solved by being examined from more angles. They become, through examination, more visible in their complexity, more clearly themselves, more available to the next person who arrives with a question and finds in the material that the question has already been living there, waiting in precisely the form that makes answering it both necessary and impossible. There is something in this that is worth holding quietly, in the way one holds a stone found on a long walk, not to analyze it, not to place it in a taxonomy, but simply because the weight of it in the hand is its own kind of contact with something that was here before the walk began and will be here after it ends. The dominion as Socrates described it, as Plato elaborated it, as the Stoics absorbed it, as Hegel historicized it, as Vlastos complicated it. This object is old now, and has been held in many different ways, and has not been broken by any of them. Plato at his writing table, returning to the question in old age, may not have known exactly what he was looking at. This is not a failure. It may be the most honest response available to someone who had been genuinely close to the phenomenon, close enough to see it clearly, too close to see it whole. The systems he built to contain it were large and elaborate and beautiful and did not quite close around it, because the thing they were built to contain was, in some essential way, resistant to containment. It was a private experience. It had happened to one person. It had shaped that person's life in ways that were visible and consequential and documented, and it had done so by saying, quietly, again and again, across decades, not this, not here, not now. And in the space that restraint opened up, the person had found, by his own lights, what to do next. The space inside a limit is not empty. This is what Plato was reaching for in the figure of Eros as intermediary, in the form of the good as unreachable destination that nevertheless shapes the direction of the ascent. The limit does not close off the interior. It gives the interior its form. What the daimonion forbade was never the whole of Socrates' life. It was the border of it, the quiet restraining line that held the shape in place, while the man himself, using his own reason and his own judgment and his own hard-won understanding of what was good, decided how to inhabit the space it preserved. Vlastos, at his desk in the late afternoon, the apology lying open beside his notes, found himself unable to resolve the tension he had named so precisely, the tension between logos and the daimonion, the tension between argument as the path to moral truth and the inarguable inner signal as an equally reliable guide. He could hold both terms of the tension clearly. He could articulate why neither could simply be abandoned without losing something essential. And he could sit with the holding, the way philosophers learn to sit with what cannot be resolved, not in defeat, not in frustration, but in the specific equanimity that comes from understanding that some tensions are features of the question itself, and not failures of the inquiry. Outside his window, or whatever window one imagines for the scholar returning once more to an old puzzle, the world continued in its ordinary way. The long chain of readers and readers stretched backward into the academy, and forward into whatever room holds the next person who opens the apology with genuine attention and finds there, almost incidentally introduced, the mention of a voice that had been present since childhood, that had never told Socrates what to do, that had only and always, and without once being wrong, told him where not to go. The question that voice left behind, what it was, what it means, what it says about the relationship between argument and intuition, between reason and the inarticulate signal, between the examined life and the life that is examined by something beyond examination, has been traveling for 24 centuries and has not found its resting place. It moves through the tradition, the the way light moves through a room after the lamp is set down, slowly reaching into corners, touching what it finds there gently, leaving things slightly more visible than they were before. On an ordinary morning in Athens, with no particular weight to the day, Socrates stopped in the middle of a sentence and let his hands come to rest at his sides, not because a thought had left him, not because he was searching for a word. The pause was something else, something quieter than thought, a familiar interior stillness that had arrived, as it always arrived, without announcement and without drama. The man he had been speaking to waited. Socrates did not seem to notice the waiting. His hands were still. His face was unhurried. And then after a moment that may have been short or long, the stillness passed, and he continued speaking, picking up the sentence where he had left it, as though nothing had occurred. To the person watching, it might have looked like distraction. It might have looked like the small interruption that comes to any mind in the middle of any ordinary exchange. But those who had known Socrates long enough had stopped interpreting these pauses as interruptions. They had come to understand that this was simply how a life accustomed to listening looked from the outside, still, unhurried, completely present to something no one else in the conversation could hear. His hands rested at his sides. The morning went on around him. Whatever the interior signal had been, a restraint, a quiet halt, the familiar texture of a life lived in attentiveness, it had come and gone without urgency, as it always did, leaving him exactly where he was. What stays with a person who learns to attend to that kind of interior quiet is not always something they can name. It is less a message than a quality of attention, a slight shift in the texture of a moment, something that has been running beneath the surface of a day, now briefly legible. The way the grain of a wooden table becomes visible when the light changes and falls across it at a different angle. Socrates had been noticing this quality since childhood, had learned across decades to take it seriously, and had arrived somewhere in the middle of a long philosophical life, at a relationship with it that required almost no effort to maintain. He did not pursue it. He did not perform it for others. He simply did not ignore it, which is perhaps the whole of what being genuinely attentive requires. The examined life, as Socrates described it, was not only the life turned toward argument, toward the careful, patient testing of beliefs and dialogue in question. It was also this, the interior life tuned to itself, not in mysticism, not in withdrawal, but in the daily, practical, entirely ordinary act of noticing what the inside of a moment feels like before acting within it. These two things, the rigorous outer examination and the quiet inner attentiveness, were not separate practices running alongside each other. They were the same practice, seen from two directions, the same life, in the same city, on the same unremarkable morning, continuing. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. That sentence, spoken in the Apology before a jury of 501, is the most quoted thing Socrates ever said, and perhaps the most misread. It is almost always quoted as a challenge, a demand for intellectual rigor, a call to constant analysis and philosophical questioning, and it is that. But read alongside everything else Socrates said and did, it is also something quieter, an invitation to notice what is already present, the inner life that a person already has, the interior texture of their own experience, the small signals that arise before decisions and during conversations, and on unremarkable mornings when nothing dramatic is happening and the hands are simply resting, still, at the sides. Self-examination requires both of these things. The external dialogue, the argument tested in conversation with another mind, and the interior attentiveness, the willingness to pause and listen to what the inside of one's own moment contains, even when that listening looks, from the outside, like nothing more than a man stopping briefly in the middle of a sentence. Hannah Arendt had read Socrates carefully, and what she found there troubled her in the way that only things genuinely worth thinking about trouble a mind. She was working on a long project, late in her life, that she called the life of the mind, and she kept returning to Socrates, not to the Socrates of any single argument, but to the Socrates who paused, who questioned, who seemed always to be conducting two conversations at once, one with the person in front of him, and one with some interior interlocutor who never quite went away. What she found, looking at this carefully, was something about the structure of thinking itself. Thinking, Arendt argued, is never a solitary activity in the way it first appears. Even in complete physical solitude, in a room with no other person present, the mind that genuinely thinks is never alone. It is always, in some structural sense, a dialogue, a voice and a response, a question posed, and then a pause, in which the self waits to see what the self will say. The two-in-one, she called it, the self as its own interlocutor. Not a division, not a disorder, but simply the natural shape of a mind in genuine conversation with itself, the same shape that external dialogue takes, turned inward and made silent. Arendt was sitting in New York when she worked through these ideas, her copy of the Phaedrus nearby, and what she noticed in Socrates was the specific concrete form that this inner dialogue had taken in a particular human life. The daimonion was not, in her reading, something alien to thought. It was something continuous with it, the voice of the self as its own interlocutor, operating at a level below argument, prior to reasoning, arising from the part of the inner life that has been living attentively long enough to have developed its own kind of knowledge. Not knowledge in the sense of propositions that can be stated and defended, knowledge in the sense of a reliable familiarity with the territory of one's own experience, accumulated over decades of honest self-examination, present in the moment of decision as a kind of quiet, interior recognition. She connected this with characteristic precision to conscience. The capacity for moral judgment, she thought, is not separable from the capacity for genuine thinking. A person who has stopped conducting the inner dialogue, who has stopped examining, who has stopped listening to their own interior interlocutor, loses not only philosophical acuity, but something morally essential. The inner voice goes quiet, not because it has been answered, but because the habit of listening to it has been abandoned. And when it goes quiet in that way, Arendt thought, something more than philosophy is lost. This is a claim that does not announce itself. It sits in the reading, patient, waiting to be noticed. The capacity to think, genuinely, honestly, without the evasions that come from wanting a particular answer, and the capacity for moral seriousness are, in her account, aspects of the same interior practice. Socrates did not keep his inner life separate from his philosophical life. They were the same life, conducted simultaneously, in full view of the city that eventually decided it could no longer accommodate both. Immanuel Kant had made his own version of this claim, differently and from a different direction, arriving at something that resembles the daimonion in certain lights and differs from it in others. Kant's moral conscience was inner. It was authoritative. It did not depend on social approval, on the agreement of others, on the validation of any external institution. A person who acted rightly because the city expected it, or because their friends would admire it, or because a priest had approved it, was not in Kant's account acting morally at all. The genuinely moral act comes from inside, from a faculty that does not look outward for its measure. In this, Kant and Socrates are close. Both locate the ultimate source of moral authority within the individual, beyond the reach of custom and approval and institutional sanction. Both trust an inner principle more than the collective judgment of those around them. Both found that this trust, followed honestly, brought them into conflict with their times in ways they did not seek and did not regret. But the difference runs deep, and it is worth sitting with. Kant's moral faculty was fully rational. Its deliverances could be expressed as a principle, tested for consistency, made universal. The categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim by which you could, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law, is exactly the kind of thing that can be argued, examined, debated, refined. It enters the public space of reason. It can be explained to anyone who is willing to follow the argument. It can in principle be shared. The daimonion could not be shared. It arrived, as Socrates consistently described it, as a private signal, something he recognized and trusted, something that had accompanied him since childhood with perfect reliability. But it was not, and never claimed to be, a principle he could formulate and hand to another person. When it halted him, he could not explain the halt in terms that reached beyond the experience itself. He could report it. He could honor it. He could, as he did before the jury in the Apology, insist on its reality. But he could not reduce it to an argument, could not unfold it into a chain of reasoning another person could follow and verify. This was precisely what troubled Gregory Vlastos, who spent his scholarly life trying to make coherent sense of the Socrates he admired above all other philosophers. Vlastos had opened before him. At some point across the long years, he thought about Socrates, the Apology, and the puzzle that would not resolve itself. Here was a man who had made reason the foundation of everything, who would accept no belief that could not survive rigorous examination, who had insisted again and again across decades of philosophical conversation that the only way to reach the truth about how to live was through argument, patient, careful, willing to follow the reasoning wherever it led, unwilling to accept conclusions merely because they were convenient or comfortable or already believed. This was the Socrates Vlastos had committed his intellectual life to understanding, and yet this same man had trusted, all his life, a signal that could not be argued for, that could not be examined by the methods he had given to philosophy, that arrived and was heeded without question, without the dialectic that was his entire philosophical instrument. The man who had said that a belief not examined was not worth holding had held, for 70 years, an allegiance to an interior experience that he had never subjected to examination, could not have subjected to examination, because the examination would have needed something to work on, and the daimonion did not offer that. It offered only itself. Vlastos sat with this tension rather than resolving it. He named it and held it open. And there is something worth noticing in the fact that this act of sitting with an unresolved tension, of naming an honest difficulty and leaving it named rather than forcing a conclusion, is itself the most Socratic thing a philosopher can do. The man who trusted an unexaminable voice had also taught the world that the examined life is the only one worth living. Both things are true. They do not fit together neatly. They may not need to. Jonathan Haidt had arrived at a version of this difficulty from a completely different direction, not through the history of philosophy, but through the study of how human beings actually make moral judgments. What happens in the sequence of events between an encounter with a morally significant situation and a person's confident sense that they know what is right? What he found was that the sequence, almost everyone assumes, first the reasoning, then the judgment, is largely inverted. The moral intuition tends to arrive first. It is immediate, pre-reflective, confident. The reasoning comes after, and its function is often less to discover the right answer than to explain and justify the answer the intuition has already reached. This is a finding that can feel at first deflating. If the reasoning is largely post hoc, if the real work is being done by something prior to argument, then what is the philosophy for? But this misses what the finding actually shows. It does not say that reasoning is useless, or that careful moral thought changes nothing. It says that the source of moral conviction sits deeper than reasoning, in a faculty that has been shaped by everything a person has experienced and learned and practiced and lived. The quality of that faculty, its reliability, its sensitivity, its freedom from self-interest and habit and convenient distortion is itself something that can be cultivated, slowly, across a life of honest attention. Socrates had spent 70 years in exactly this cultivation. Not only the external cultivation of argument and dialogue, the patient examination of others' beliefs and his own, but the interior cultivation of attentiveness, the practiced willingness to notice what arose in him before acting, the lifelong discipline of taking the inner signal seriously, even when it arrived without explanation and could not be handed to anyone else. By the time he stood in the Athenian court, whatever was operating in him as a moral faculty had been shaped by 7 decades of this practice into something of unusual reliability, not infallible, not divine in the sense the court feared, but genuinely cultivated in the way that a craftsman's sense of proportion is cultivated, present in the hand before it, is present in the mind, immediately available, faster than thought, earned by years of honest work. Antonio Damasio had a name for the bodily dimension of this kind of signal. The somatic marker, he called it, the way the body registers, in sensation and feeling, the significance of situations before conscious reasoning has caught up. These markers are not random or arbitrary, they are laid down by experience. They accumulate along the grain of a life, becoming more precise and more reliable as a person lives honestly and attentively and learns from what they encounter. In a person who has cultivated virtue, not performed it, but genuinely lived by it, across years of daily practice, these interior signals begin to carry a kind of moral weight that cannot be fully explained, but is not, for that reason, irrational. It is a form of accumulated practical wisdom, held in the body as much as in the mind, present in the quiet interior signal that arrives, sometimes, before a decision has been consciously reached. Socrates would not have used any of these words. He did not have them. What he had was the experience itself, which he described with the calm matter-of-factness of someone reporting a familiar feature of the landscape he had walked every day for decades. The voice, the signal, the inner restraint that arrived to stop him from what he was about to do, and then was quiet, leaving the decision to him. He did not theorize it beyond what was necessary to report it honestly. He did not try to give it to anyone else. He simply trusted it and lived accordingly, and the philosophical life that resulted from that trust left behind a conversation that has not yet found a stopping place. Somewhere in that conversation, across centuries and languages and disciplines, no one in Athens had yet imagined. A long thread runs. Plato listening to Socrates and trying to find a philosophical form large enough for what he had witnessed, and writing in the Symposium of Eros as the intermediary daimon, the spirit that occupies the space between the human and the divine, carrying what passes between them, because nothing purely human and nothing purely divine can reach all the way across the distance alone. This was his attempt, decades after the death of his teacher, to make philosophical sense of something he had not entirely understood while he was witnessing it, and perhaps still did not entirely understand when he wrote. Marcus Aurelius, in his military tent on the Danube frontier, writing by lamplight what he called simply his notes to himself, returning again and again to the image of an inner governing faculty, the hegemonikon, the ruling part, that knows with reliable clarity what is and is not within a person's power. He had never met Socrates. He was separated from him by 5 centuries and by the full breadth of the Roman world. But something in what Socrates had left behind had reached him, filtered through Stoic philosophy, refined and made systematic by Zeno and Epictetus, and a long chain of teachers between them, and what Marcus found in it was what he needed in the tent on the frontier, a way of locating, inside the noise of a besieged and demanding life, the interior signal that knew what was actually required. Hegel, in a lecture hall in Berlin, arguing to students that Socrates was not simply a wise man who died unjustly, but a figure through whom something genuinely new entered history, the principle of individual subjective moral conscience, the claim that the interior life of a single person could carry an authority capable of standing against the authority of the state and the collective life of the culture. Athens had not been wrong to feel threatened by this. The threat was real. The principle Socrates embodied was genuinely incompatible with the principle Athens embodied, and when they met, both were real, and neither was simply mistaken, and the tragedy belonged to history itself rather than to any individual caught in it. Hegel said this not to diminish what happened to Socrates, but to give it its proper weight, the weight of a historical turning, a genuine shift in what it becomes possible for a human being to claim about the source of their own moral authority. And Arendt again, last in the line, returning to her desk in New York and returning to Socrates, and finding in him not a historical figure requiring interpretation, but something more immediate, a way of being in the world that she recognized as still available, still necessary, still the most honest answer anyone had given to the question of how to remain a moral person in a world that does not always make that easy. The thinking, she said, the inner dialogue, the willingness to be alone with the self that is one's own interlocutor, and to not evade what that interlocutor says. This is what Socrates had. This is what the daimonion pointed toward. Not a supernatural visitor, but the deepest structure of an honest inner life, the self in genuine conversation with itself, patient enough to hear what the conversation requires. There is someone lying awake in the particular stillness before sleep arrives, in a quiet room where the day's noise has subsided and the interior of a moment becomes briefly audible again, not because anything dramatic has occurred, not because a decision is pressing or a problem demands resolution, just the ordinary stillness that comes when the external claims on attention have fallen quiet and the interior life becomes for a moment gently perceptible. A hesitation about something not yet decided. A quiet signal, arriving without argument, noticed without urgency. The felt texture of the moment, before thought has caught up with it. What Socrates would say about this, if he could say anything, is probably not what is usually attributed to him. He would not say that the signal should be trusted blindly, or that reasoning can be abandoned in its favor. He spent his life insisting that honest examination is never finished, that the interior life requires the same rigor as the arguments tested in the agora. But he would also say, and this is the part that tends to get less attention, that a life wholly committed to external examination, to argument and dialectic, and the public testing of beliefs, is not complete if the interior life is not also attended to. The signal that cannot be argued for is still real. The inner restraint that arrives without explanation is still worth noticing. These are not alternatives to the examined life. They are part of it, the part that lives below language, below the reach of the dialectic, in the accumulated quiet of a life that has been genuinely and honestly attended to across time. The examined life, fully lived, is not only the life of argument, it is the life of attentiveness, both at once. The careful thinker in dialogue, and the still figure whose hands have come to rest at the sides, listening to something that has no name, but is, after decades of quiet familiarity, entirely recognizable. Across 24 centuries, the conversation Socrates began has continued without pause. Different languages, different centuries, different problems, different forms of the same underlying questions. What is it to live well? What does the inner life owe to the outer? What authority does conscience carry when the world outside disagrees with it? Where exactly is the line between wisdom and stubbornness, between trust and credulity, between a life genuinely examined and a life merely busy with self-examination? These questions have not been resolved. The philosophers who have sat with them longest are the ones most certain they have not been resolved. But something has accumulated in the sitting, a way of holding the questions, a quality of attentiveness that the questions themselves seem to require, and that they reward, over time, with a certain kind of peace, not the peace of having found the answers, but the peace of having become genuinely comfortable with the fact that the questions are here and will remain here and are not, in the end, a threat to anything. Socrates in the Agora on an ordinary morning, not a day of crisis, not the day of the trial, not any of the days that historians have marked as significant. Just a plain morning, with the light coming in off the Aegean and the craftsmen opening their shops, and the city starting its day in the way cities always do, indifferent to the philosophical conversations occurring within it. Socrates stops a man he knows, not to interrogate him, not to dismantle his assumptions, but simply to ask what he most deeply values, and then listens with his full attention, the way a person listens when they are genuinely curious and not already formulating a response, the way a person listens when they have learned, across a long philosophical life, that other people's answers carry something real, even when those answers are confused, even when the confusion is itself the most interesting thing. This is also part of the examined life, the attention turned outward, toward another person's experience, the question asked not to defeat, but to understand, the listening that does not already know the answer, it is waiting to hear. And what Socrates did in these ordinary encounters on ordinary mornings was practice the same quality of attentiveness he brought to his own interior, the same willingness to let the signal arrive before acting on the assumption that he already knew what it would say. The outer dialogue and the inner dialogue were not separate activities. They were the same discipline held by the same person on the same ordinary morning in the same city that would eventually run out of patience with both of them. The conversation has passed forward in the way that the oldest and most lasting conversations pass, not by inheritance, not by authority, not by any institution requiring it, by one person reading carefully what another person wrote, and finding in it something that speaks to their own experience of being a thinking, uncertain, morally serious creature moving through a world that is never as clear as it ought to be. Plato reading Socrates in the sense that he had lived beside him and then spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he had witnessed. Hegel reading Plato and finding in the dialectic something that explained the movement of history. Arendt reading Hegel and finding in him tools she then turned back toward Socrates, her beginning, someone in a quiet room, long after all of them, reading any one of these texts and finding in it the same thread, the same basic claim that the interior life is real, that it carries authority, that attending to it honestly is not a retreat from the world, but a form of engagement with it that the world, most of the time, most urgently needs. The daemonian across this whole long conversation has remained exactly what it was, a private signal, a quiet halt, something that arrived without argument and could not be argued for, and was nonetheless trusted by one man across one long life, with the kind of consistency that gradually makes a life into a particular shape rather than an accumulation of decisions. It did not make Socrates wise. He was wise in other ways, by other means, through the dialectic and the relentless examination and the decades of asking questions in the market. But it may have kept him honest in a specific and particular way, kept him from the actions that the deeper part of his accumulated attentiveness recognized as wrong before the argument had caught up, before the reasoning could be conducted. In the brief interval between intention and act, where the most important moral information sometimes lives, the interior stillness that has gathered in this room, in this hour, in the particular quiet that belongs to the slow approach of sleep, is not nothing. It is the natural settling of an attentive life, the body and mind finding their way toward rest after the day's demands, the interior texture of a moment becoming briefly perceptible as the external noise subsides. In this stillness, which belongs to no particular philosophy and requires no particular belief, there is something continuous with what Socrates trusted, the signal that cannot be argued for, the inner quiet that is not empty, the recognition, arriving without urgency, that the interior life is present and real and worth attending to. He did not tell his listeners what to do with this. He would not have thought it was his place to tell them. He asked questions. He examined assumptions. He stopped, sometimes in the middle of a sentence, and let his hands rest at his sides, and waited for the interior moment to pass, and then continued. The life he built from these ordinary gestures was the most examined philosophical life the ancient world produced, and at the end of it, the dominion was still there, present in the morning of the trial, present in the days of imprisonment, present in the last conversation with his friends, which was, as it always was, about the questions that did not resolve. What is the soul? What is death? What is there reason to hope for? What does a life honestly lived deserve? The signal was silent on the morning of the trial. It was silent throughout the proceedings. It remained silent in the days that followed, in the cell, in the conversations, in the last morning.